Living in a different country takes a lot of work, but many people do it all the time. I used to live in both Europe and Asia because my parents were first in the military and then they became teachers for the Department of Defense dependent schools. In 2011, Michael of the Economic Collapse Online blog gives this amazing statistic. According to the U.S. State Department, 6.3 million Americans either work or study outside of the U.S. That is one of the highest numbers ever recorded. Have you ever wanted to live outside of the U.S. but didn't know where to go, what to do, or even where to start? It can all be so very confusing. Well, first things first, do you want to figure out what country you're going to move to? Do you want to live in somewhere in Asia, or how about somewhere in Europe? My favorite out of the two is Europe. Now, you figured out where you're moving to. What happens next? Well, first thing you need to do is to learn the language. Then you want to figure out what is true and what is false about what you've heard about the country that you're moving to. And finally, you want to find out what there is to do in the country of choice. Figuring out what is involved in moving to a different country takes a lot of research as well as effort. Now, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what kind of barriers might we run across when moving to a different country? For the sake of my speech, let's focus on Germany and Korea as our countries of choice. The first barrier you might run across would be language. For most countries, language can be a difficult barrier to cross. I think Asian languages are a lot more difficult to learn than European languages, because of the different honorific systems and the different characters that are used. European languages can be considered easier to learn because a lot of them are considered Romance languages. For example, Italian, French, Spanish, and German. Although there are some things that might confuse an English speaker when trying to learn a different language, such as German. Paul Schuwater of the Frankfurt International School says that about 95 million people in the world know how to speak German. The German alphabet is very similar to the English alphabet, although they have different characters. They also have different pronunciations for certain letters, such as W. W is pronounced with a V sound. Let's take Bratwurst, which is how most Americans would say it, and Bratwurst, which is how Germans say it. Learning to read and write Korean is a lot easier than learning to speak Korean. Alfred Jensen, who is a teacher of the Korean language, says that Korea has the only truly phonetic alphabet in Asia. This alphabet is called Hangul. The most basic form of spoken Korean is not the most polite. And because of the honorific system that's used that changes or affects the verbs and nouns, and the 5 levels of respect, as well as the alternate words that you need to use when speaking to someone that's considered socially higher than yourself, all of this makes learning to speak Korean a lot more difficult than learning to read and write Korean. Now, the second barrier you might run across is misconceptions. I remember when I first moved to Korea with my family, I had a separate family member that warned us not to leave our dogs out because they might get eaten by the locals. This misconception comes from an older generation of Koreans. Paul of Teaching Kimchi says that when it comes down to it, a dog is an animal like any other that is technically edible and is valued differently in the older Korean culture than in the American one. Now, talking about misconceptions, let's talk about kimchi. When we first moved to Korea, I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea whatsoever about kimchi. Kimchi is a fermented cabbage. It's very spicy. And when we went to the restaurant for the very first time, I took a mouthful, not knowing what it was, what to expect, and I was in for a very rude and spicy awakening. I'm sure it was extremely comical to watch because of my facial expressions, but after eating the kimchi, my sinuses were clear for several days. And I also fell into the misconception that all Koreans like eating kimchi. But as Paul says, it's kind of like saying that all Americans love eating hamburgers, isn't it? I have to agree. Now, Germany also has misconceptions because it is the homeland of not of Hitler, as well as the home base for most of the Nazi operations. There are a lot of ignorant people that consider all Germans to be either Nazis or Nazi supporters, and that's not true. Germans can also be considered rude, unfeeling, blunt, and cold. But I have personal experience that, Germans are not rude. They actually are very friendly and familiar with people who are trying to learn their culture and language. They are very helpful.